Thank you, Jack. So it's a similar similar type of project. It's a community project, and it's a coastal monastic site. There's a lot of similarities, but Coldingham Priory and the community partnership that developed at Coldingham Priory, I believe, is somewhat of a unique situation, and it's not one that's all that archaeological. So for anybody looking for some nice pictures of trenches and things, you'll be sorely disappointed, I'm afraid. But hopefully we'll give you some good information. So for those of you who aren't familiar with Berwickshire or with Coldingham, we have Coldingham there. Just to the northeast of us is St. Abbs. Either one of these is supposedly the site of the original double monastery. Double meaning it had both men and women there, of St. Eva, Northumbrian princess. And the jury's still out on which is which, or maybe it's a chicken and egg thing, which came first. But certainly most of our early medieval evidence is coming from Coldingham rather than St. Abbs. But Coldingham certainly is medieval in its in the ruins that we have now are medieval. The priory sits at the heart of the community in Coldingham, and this is actually kind of crucial for this process, or for this project. The community of Coldingham has had a long and more recently troubled history with the priory. It is the center of their community. It's maintained as the parish church. Good number of the people in the community go to church there. Many people were married there, and many people are buried there. And it's still a working churchyard. The church itself is owned by the Church of Scotland, and then the churchyard is maintained by Scottish Borders Council. And that's actually caused me some heartache in the last year as well. What is known about the priory? Well, I've mentioned something of the early historic history. It's first mentioned by Bede as Urbs Collodi, 7th century place name. It may or may not be Kirkhill, St. Abbs. It may or may not be Coldingham itself. We have evidence that either Kirkhill or Coldingham was raided by Danes in 870, leading to a horrific account of self-mutilation by the nuns there to keep the Vikings off their backs. It didn't work, and they were killed anyway. But the historic association of Coldingham kept coming up through the ages. It was within the diocese of Durham by the 11th century, and then under King Edgar in 1098, a Romanesque church was built there after he had given Coldingham a substantial grant. And then by 1147 there was a Benedictine priory, and that's really the beginning of our story in terms of the ruins that are there just now. In the 12th and 13th century, Coldingham Priory became one of the richer monastic communities in southeast Scotland. And Coldingham itself, the town of Coldingham, is said to have had more inns than Berwick upon Tweed, which of course was second only to London as a port. So you can imagine the wealth that must have been coming in and out of that community in the 12th and 13th century. But being where it is, right near a border, it was occupied and burned and sacked and all manner of things done to it over the next few centuries. And most notably, there was the siege of English forces who were housed in the church, and that this will become relevant in a bit, in 1544 to 5, the Scottish laying siege to the English there. And then the rest of it was just trashed by Cromwell, as so much is trashed by Cromwell in 1648. The ruins of the church itself were incorporated into the later parish church. And I've got some good pictures of that here in a bit. But if you go into the church today, you see some of the most fantastic medieval walls for it was the choir of the church that surviving, I think, in southeast Scotland. So that's as it is in the 19th century. Because the ruins were ever present in the community, and because of the popularity of the coast and the journey time from Edinburgh, Coldingham had a lot of antiquarian interest coming its way. And so various accounts were made of Cromwell there and the English occupation, and there was all sorts of attempts to connect this to Saint Ebba right the way from the 18th century. And it's possibly because of this antiquarian interest that we are actually able to have these medieval walls upstanding and incorporated within the church itself. But as you can see there on the left-hand image, there's a substantial amount of making the ground up around the church over time, and this has obscured a lot of the ruinous priory underneath. The antiquarian interest also gave us one of the most remarkable collection of medieval carved stones in Scotland, which is the lapidarium. And you have fantastic burial monuments and green men up there at the top, and the funny little dude looking down at you all the time when you go in there. His eyes seem to follow you. It's kind of creepy. But it's a great little collection of stones, and these were in a pretty poor state of repair up until recently. And Coldingham, because it sits in the heart of the community, because of this antiquarian interest, community archaeology there is nothing new. People have been, robbing the priory ruins for years, for decades, for centuries. In fact, I led a small team of volunteers around the village one day, peeking into people's gardens, and that's where the priory is. It's not in the actual site itself. There's carved stones all over that place. But in the late 60s and early 70s, there was a substantial excavation carried out by the Berkshire Naturalists Club, and they uncovered quite a bit of the ruins that we have today. They uncovered the cloisters, they uncovered the refectory, some of the chapter house, and very little effort to backfill or to do any kind of cleaning up after themselves at all, which actually created more harm than good. They did attempt to do some restoration of the ruins, and they had advice from the Ministry of Works at the time to rake out the joins of some of the priory walls, and then using some lovely cement mortar, they cemented up they repointed the cement and then put nice cement caps on tops of all the walls, which again did more harm than good. But at the time, at least, they were trying to do something with the place and trying to bring the ruins to life. In more recent times, we've seen quite a bit of work going on at Coldingham, actually, mostly in the form of development related work. And that's on the right-hand side there, the excavations by Headland in 2000 in the north of the Abbey Yards, where they found quite a few 9th to 10th century burials, 9th to 11th century burials, bone cones, that sort of thing, in a period when we actually don't have any historical evidence for Coldingham at all. So it does seem that there was still some sort of Christian continuity going on there between the early historic Coldingham and the medieval. But we've also had a series of geophysics field work endeavors going on at Coldingham. This is just to the guard resistivity results there, just to the south of where these guys are, showing a fairly substantial building in there, part of which was excavated in the 60s, it has to be said, so it's not anything we didn't know was there. But in the field just next to that, we also have an enormous circular enclosure of some type, and it could very well be a henge or something like that. It doesn't seem to have any discrete openings, suggestive of anything Iron Agey. But there's some interesting things going on in the fields on the other side, which actually may kind of tell us why Coldingham is there to begin with, similar to some of the talks that have been going on already today. So coming to the project itself, in 2000, the council was going to shut the place down. The Church of Scotland owns the church, but we own everything else. And somebody in their wisdom decided that the place was just too dangerous, and we'd have to shut it off to the public, bearing in mind that this is, again, at the heart of the community. Some of the walls that had been cemented over in the 60s were in dangerous state, and the vegetation growing out of the walls was eating away at the remaining lime mortar within the walls, so that they were just crumbling before your very eyes. And so the idea was taken in the council that we should just shut it down and not allow anybody in there. The council didn't have any kind of creativity about the situation, as councils tend to do, and just said, well, we can't afford to do anything with it. There was some effort to look into feasibility, the feasibility of doing work there, and there was also a structural survey that was done by Headland, showing that's the lapidarium that I showed earlier on the right, with one of the likely reconstructed arches of the, I believe that's the south transept of the cruciform church. So we had some evidence that, and most of this was almost rescued because we wanted to make sure that we had this record if the walls should fall down. So it wasn't really necessarily towards doing anything proactive. But as luck would have it, my immediate manager decided that, well, we can't just allow this to happen. So we essentially took a unique step and went to an outside group, the Tweed Forum, and said, put together a lovely funding package for us, and then we'll see if we can guilt the council into giving us some money. And out of that process came some positive responses from Historic Scotland and the National Trust, and the Heritage Lottery Fund, and some other groups. But at the same time as all this was going on, the community themselves were deeply involved in the Priory and wanting to do something great with it. And where that stone seat is there now, that's basically sitting on the backfill from the 1960s excavations, and there's a huge bund in there, which is the backfill, or the not the backfill, sorry, the spoil heaps from the 1960s excavations. So there was actually this overgrown area, which was all spoil heap. It was full of rubble. It was full of from fly tipping from the years in between the 60s and the 2000s. And it was completely overgrown, and it was an eyesore, and the community absolutely hated it. So they said, well, let's see if we can make it a nice, lovely garden. So, completely unknown to the council, they had approached Archaeology Scotland, and they adopted a monument scheme, and they officially adopted this monument and tried to get the ball rolling with getting some money to create a community garden. And somehow along the line we all came together and created this large project that sought to restore the ruins of the priory and at the same time create this community garden and have a real focus for the community again, and involve school children in the process, and involve the church in the process. And so what began as the council not wanting to wash their hands of the place has actually turned into this wonderful little project where we've now completely conserved all of the ruins, hopefully for another 50 to 100 years, and we don't have to deal with them anymore. And this community garden, well, we've also done a substantial amount of conservation of the carved stones there as well, and Graciela Ainsworth has done that admirably. All of the carved stones in the lapidarium were removed to Edinburgh, as well as some graves for some of the early bishops of Coldingham, and a couple of carved stones that we found along the way. When I originally agreed to give this, or put in my abstract for this, I had thought that we'd have a substantial amount of archaeology to tell you about, and we had nothing. We had a watching brief during the whole process, just in order to see if we had any nice carved stones and things. We weren't doing any new substantial excavation in there, but it was sort of just in case. The only thing that came out that is now a mystery, and the community is trying to solve it as we speak, the sleuths that they are these skulls that came out of the cloister. And if you see on the right, there's some masonry there, which is a retaining wall that was put in the 1970s after the excavations. Everything above that is overburden that has accumulated since the 18th century. So this retaining wall abuts that overburden just to keep it off the cloister, or what they say is the end of the cloister, but we actually haven't ever gotten to the bottom of where the cloister, the full scope of the cloister. But these skulls came out when they removed the retaining wall. They've stuck in a new retaining wall now, and we just don't know what they are. Or, well, we know what they are, but we don't know where they've come from. So there was a discrete layer of charcoal above that, and we took samples of that to see if we could find any kind of dating evidence for these skulls. But it turns out all to be waste, garden waste from the 18th, 19th century. But so the skulls remain a mystery. The one possibility for these, because they essentially sit right on either the main walkway of the cloister, or actually within the cloister garden itself, and the upper layers of the cloister garden. The one possibility is that they were chucked out of the church when the English occupied it. Because we found 3 or 4 others, and none of them were in discrete context, but they were all within one layer. So that's kind of the assumption that we're working on now, is that somebody at some point chucked out all of the bishops or what have you in the church into the cloister, pretty unceremoniously. And one of the reasons that could have been done is the occupation of the church by the English in the 16th century. So the project is now done. We've gone through our wonderful 4 years of conserving the ruins, but we very much wanted to leave a legacy with the community. The project itself had £500,000 in the kitty, and at no point was there any effort, apart from a couple of interpretation boards, to leave any kind of legacy. But we felt that we really needed to do the project and the community right by this. So we had some lovely underspend, and we were able to convince the funders to give us the opportunity to put in these carved stones at various places. This carved stone is actually where you would have passed through into the main body of the church. It's all now churchyard, the cruciform church. And so we've got these carved stones that sort of tell the story of the priory, but through the words of the children, because these were all chosen by the pupils of Coldingham Primary School. They were written and chosen by them. So it's actually in their words, and they're now leaving their own legacy with the place. And it's hoped that they'll now, as they live their lives in this community, look after the place because they have ownership of it. And we thought that was very important to give the children ownership. The rest of the community already feels a sense of ownership, but to pass that on to the younger generation was very important. But we also tried to reinstate some of the older interpretive elements. And if you look up in the right-hand corner, there's a little iron marker sitting next to a gravestone there, pointing out where the nave would have been of the cruciform church. These iron markers were put in the 1880s, and there was only one of them left. The rest of them, I assume, are in people's gardens with the rest of the priory. And so we felt that because we had one left, we had enough of a template to go ahead and produce copies of them. So we put them in. The difficulty is, and this is a warning to anybody wanting to do this kind of thing in the future, is to be very careful when staking these things out within a working churchyard. And it actually became a bit of a nightmare because there was somebody's recent burial. It just so happened to be where the corner of one of the north aisle should have been. So we've actually not staked out the church exactly. So if you're ever going there to try and pinpoint where the church should have been, you'll have a north aisle that's about 20 meters too big. But again, it's only interpretive. And then there's a sense of renewal in the community now. People are getting married at the church again. Well, people had always been getting married at the church, but people are now using this place to have parties and to actually have their wedding receptions. We had just last week or 2 weeks ago now, we had King Edgar come back to us to renew the priory. And he very kindly granted the community 24 beasts for the fields, because apparently they'd been starving to death. And it was fantastic. He reread the original charter of King Edgar, and then we had the pupils of Coldingham Priory there. But very special guest was Saint Aidan, and he showed up to. With his pals Saint Cuthbert and Saint Ebba to reopen, and they actually did a fantastic job and reopened the priory and told us about the early historic history of the place. And then we have some loose ends to tie up here now. We had these wonderful carved stones that came out of the excavations in the 1960s, and they were sitting basically in the coal store of the church until Christmas 2 years ago. They were covered in coal dust. They'd been stashed there since the 60s or 70s, and nobody knew what they were. So they gave me a call and said, "What? I had never seen them before." And they'd been published in the Berwickshire Naturalist Club, but very little since then. And what we have is a monumental inscription, Northumbrian monumental inscription. It's either Abawisa or Abadisa, so the wise Ebba, or potentially just the abbess, which is a fantastic thing to have. Then we have this great cross there. So another little organic project has developed since we started this conservation project, which is now called the Coldingham Luckenbooth project. And basically, the community lost their post office. We were closing down their communal toilets, as councils are tending to do now. So two and two have come together, and we're now knocking down the communal toilets, and the community has received substantial grants to build a new building in its place with community toilet, post office, and an interpretive wall, which will have the carved stones and hopefully a mural of Ebba and Edgar and all of this. And again, you know, it's trying to finish this project off nicely and give the community something back, and a sense that all of this history, all of this deep, rich history is still there in the community for them to have for years to come. So with that, I'll say thank you to our funders and get off the stage. Thank you.